Hi, I'm Russ Bard. I'd like to welcome you to my YouTube channel. Today I'm going to be sharing a story with you from the book I recently wrote about my family's life on the family farm back in the 60s and 70s when we were teenagers growing up. I had two brothers, and we did an assortment of things that were ill advised and dangerous, and it's a miracle we survived. I suspect a lot of you out there have had similar experiences, and I hope that my story will stimulate some of the memories that you have from your youth. Uh, the story I'm going to talk about today is in regard to when we would feed hay to the cattle. Back in those days, we didn't have the nice big round hay bales that you handle with trucks and tractors like we do now. All we have were little square bales. You still see little square bales once in a while. A lot of people that have just a few cattle or some horses like to have the square bales because it's easier to feed a small amount with less waste with the little bales. But that was all we had at the time, so we would oftentimes have to feed a lot of the little square bales in order to get an adequate supply of feed out for the cattle. The way our farm was set up was that my dad and his brothers had acquired the smaller farms around Truman Lake as they were being sold off as the older farmers retired and moved to town. We would just consolidate. And as a result of that, a lot of these old farms would have old farmhouses. A lot of them were the same style. Would have a two rooms in front and then a third room in the middle and kind of in the back, and then a smaller like a porch on each side. Sometimes those were enclosed to make another room. Sometimes they were just open porches. The building we were talking about today had two front rooms. One had been used as a living room. One was probably a bedroom, maybe. And then behind that would have been the kitchen area. And in order for us to put hay in these old buildings, we would convert one of the windows on the side of the building into a door. Just take the glass and frame out and put a wooden frame and a wooden door on it, and then just pass the hay bales. The doors were just about the right size to get a small square hay bale through. So we would pass one of the hay bales through the door, and a person from out on the wagon or truck would put the bale off the truck through the door into the front room, and the person inside would carry the bale back through a door into the other room and stack it in the other room, which would have been the kitchen area. We My uncle was in charge of hay, everything to do with hay, and he liked for us to stack the hay in just as tight as we could, get as much packed in as we can, which just made sense because you didn't want to wind up with more hay than you had room to stack it. So we would stack all these old buildings just as tight and full as we could. And at the time we're talking about today, my brother and I were about 13 or 14 years old, probably, which we'd been feeding hay for a long time at that point because we started young back then, doing chores and things around the farm. So it was not uncommon for us to be out working unsupervised and on our own. And we had an old pickup backed up to the side of the building, and my brother was out on the pickup stacking the hay because he was going to be the one throwing the hay off with a pitchfork for the cow, so he liked to stack it the way he wanted to stack it. And I was just dragging it out of the barn and handing it out to him. And since he was quite a bit bigger than I was, that was fine because it meant gravity was on my side and I was putting everything downhill. The trouble started when I had to start a new row of bales back in the barn because the hay was stacked so high that I couldn't reach all the way to the top from the floor, so I had to leave one row of bales across the floor to stand on when I started pulling bales from the top row. And the hay was stacked in really tight, and I was tugging on it and straining. I couldn't get it loose, and so I asked my brother to come in and help me. So he boosted me up so that I could get a hold of the bales on top and try and pull them out. And I wound up with him holding me, not quite up onto his shoulders, but pretty high around my waist. And I was climbing up and tugging on the bale. And it was really dark back in there on top of the haystack. And I have to mention at this time that I used to watch a lot of science fiction movies back when I was a kid. A lot of those old black and white movies from back in the 50s and 60s that always had weird stuff going on. They had a pretty wild imagination on top of that. But anyway, he was boosting me up on the hay, and I was tugging on the hay, and I look up, and I swear to goodness, I saw what looked like the biggest old brown hay spider I'd ever seen, and it looked like it was just coming right at me because it was running. I was sure it was running and running straight for me and right at my neck. And so I didn't even think about it. I just took both arms and pushed against that row of hay bales and shoved backward as hard as I could. And my brother didn't know any of this was going on. He was just standing there with his head kind of tucked into my side, holding me up. So when I shoved backwards, he wasn't prepared for it. And he just took one step backwards off into midair and just kind of hung there a little bit like Wile E. Coyote and then fell over backwards on his back and landed on the floor. Fortunately for me, I landed on top of him. He broke my fall. And luckily, he had just a little bit of a small patch of hay on the hay chaff on the floor that I really don't think broke his fall very much. But we didn't discuss it. As soon as we got on the floor, I jumped up and started screaming and ran out of the building because I didn't want that spider to jump off and grab me by the neck or on my back or anything. And since Brian really wasn't that curious about what was going on, he just knew that if I was leaving that fast, maybe he should too. So he jumped up and ran out too. So we got outside, ran far enough away from the building we felt safe, and he stopped and asked me what the heck was going on. So I explained to him that there was this great big spider on top of the haystack and that it was about to get me. So he kind of forgave me for pushing him off the haystack at that moment. But anyway, so we got a plan together. We decided we'd get some tree limbs to use for clubs for combat, and we would go back and take the building back from the spider and kill the spider if we had to, or just run him out, whatever. But so we got our clubs. We kind of crept back into the building, went into the first room, looked around, made sure he wasn't on the ceiling or anything. And then we crept into the second room where the commotion had started. And slowly I eased up and looked over the top of the haystack with my club ready, prepared to do battle. And I discovered that the big hay spider I was so afraid of was, in fact, a brown jersey glove that apparently had come off somebody's hand back in the summer when they were putting the hay up in the barn. And my brother was not really amused. I think he was still a little bit sore from being pushed off the bale. But we recovered the glove and got the hay pulled out and didn't tell anybody about our misadventure. But anyway, we survived. Anyway, that is the story of the big hay spider. If you like that, please hit the like button and please subscribe. I will be telling more stories, sharing them on YouTube from the book I wrote, Becoming Brother Possum. This is available on Amazon.com. And if you would like to order one, please do. I would really appreciate it. Again, thank you very much for listening to my story.